Hey everyone, and welcome to the Sunny Go One Piece podcast. On this episode, we're going to be diving into episodes 435 through 437, which will cover manga chapters 534 through 536. And the heat gets turned up on Luffy and the gang as they need to get past the famed Warden of Impel Down in order to proceed further into the depths of the hellish prison. So, synopsis. Luffy must now face the fearsome Warden Magellan, but can he defeat such a formidable adversary with a seemingly unbeatable devil fruit power and push his way down into Impel Down's level 5, where Ace might presumably be held? But this is looking like it's going to be very difficult as he will now have to face him alone. Alright, so differences. There were quite a few differences in these episodes as it's clear that they're adding in a lot of filler scenes to kind of drag out the pacing so that they can buy some more time for the manga to proceed on ahead. And so you have a lot of different scenes being inserted in that kind of either try to extend a certain scene or just completely insert one altogether. So first off, we have scenes like Boncré trying to think of ways to help defeat Magellan. Those were all added in the anime. The anime actually also shows what happened to Buggy and Galdino during the level 3 attack when they were trying to get past the level 3 gate where Hannibal is stationed. In the manga, you don't actually get to see this attack. It just cuts back to them already being beat up. Another one is the anime shows Boncré saving Galdino and Buggy. However, again, in the manga, this is a surprise reveal, and you don't actually know that they've been saved until after they're in that little office and Boncré transforms back into himself. Also, when on level 5, and when that area is revealed for the first time in the anime, that prisoner with the frostbite, he kind of just laments that his fingers have frozen over and can't move them. However, in the manga, the dude's finger just literally breaks off because it's already frozen solid, and when he tries to move it, it just falls to the ground, which is pretty grim. And I'm assuming that they cut this out for censorship reasons. And then lastly, after they get stuck in level 5, there are far more scenes and lines of dialogue from Galdino and Buggy just trying to figure out what to do while Boncré gets attacked by the wolves. In the manga, we don't actually see the wolves necessarily rip Boncré up. I mean, in the anime, you don't actually see it too, but it's kind of implied. However, in the manga, you just see a panel of the wolves kind of staring at Boncré, and then you get another panel of Buggy and Galdino just kind of scurrying off behind, and then you see them running away, and that's it. You don't actually get this whole conversation that they have later about what to do next, what they should be doing, and all of that. So a lot of these scenes, they kind of fill in what happened. And these type of fillers, while it does drag the pacing of the series down quite a bit, I don't have that big of an issue because most of it is just kind of filling in the gaps of what Oda already wrote. And so I don't necessarily have too big of an issue with this, other than the fact that it keeps us from getting to the good stuff sooner. But yeah, overall, these differences, while it does hurt the pacing quite a bit, they're not as offensive as some of the other additions or changes that we've seen in the past. Alrighty, so let's get into the episodes, and here we go. We start these episodes with a marquee matchup of Magellan versus Luffy. Like Galdino, Magellan's fruit has affected his physical body, and like Galdino sweats wax, Magellan sweats poison. And first, I have to praise Oda here for his setup of this scene, because I remember I truly didn't know what was going to happen. He has all the escape routes sealed off. There's really nowhere to run. But at the same time, you as the reader or viewer don't really believe that Luffy and Boncré can beat Magellan unless they can figure out a way to hit him without actually touching him. Although Oda did hint to us how that might actually be accomplished in the last episode if you were paying attention. I'm not going to say here just in case you didn't put it together, so I'm not going to spoil it. But even with that, strategy, this fight with Magellan would be very difficult. And Boncré's dedication and loyalty to Luffy here is so damn admirable, though. He does everything in his power, even taking a Gomu Gomu no pistol from him just to stop him from touching Magellan's poison. Then he transforms into him yet again, willing to sacrifice himself to let Luffy run, even though Luffy is stubbornly trying to stay and fight. The transformation scene is pretty funny too, with him trying to pass himself off as the real Luffy, but it's clear as day which one the real one is. If not just by the clothes, but by the crazy differences in their personas. Like, it's so obvious. Also, hearing Mayumi Tanaka do the Bonkure voice is amazing as well. I never get tired of hearing that. And I gotta say, speaking of Luffy, this stubbornness from Luffy, which usually is a strength for him, but when it's clear he's putting others at risk due to it, is when it starts to kind of irritate you. At least it does for me. Bonkure is trying to help him desperately, but Luffy it just idiotically keeps pushing the fact and in turn putting them both at risk. And this is still one of Luffy's weaknesses as a leader and a captain. And it's this idea that he won't or can't think of alternatives, especially running when it's necessary. It's these big and small moments that reinforce to us that Luffy still has a lot of growing to do and maturing as well to do. Just like with Sabaody against Sentomaru and the Pacifistas, if they had just run sooner, then maybe they wouldn't have suffered such a devastating defeat, and they could have at least put some of the crew back together and also maybe have avoided that traumatic experience altogether. Now, I don't think they could have outrun Sentomaru or the Pacifistas, and especially once Kizaru had arrived. You're not outrunning light, so... But I think the idea still stands that yes, Luffy, by constantly trying to stay and fight opponents that he can't beat, it is a strength and a weakness. I mean, there are times where yes, when Luffy just stands his ground and keeps fighting people that are stronger than him, it's awesome. But at a certain point, you have to realize like you are far outmatched and you are putting everybody else in danger. And the point is that as a captain, you need to know when those two situations are and make that decision based on what you think is best for your crew. And I think Luffy still lacks the maturity and foresight to be able to make those decisions. He just constantly just defaults to, I'm going to beat this guy up. That being said, at the same time though, from a storytelling standpoint, this is great. Because, like I've reiterated before, this allows Luffy to grow. And while to some people Luffy can be seen as a static protagonist that affects the world around him dynamically, Luffy also himself is a dynamic character. I don't think he is a static character. Like, he himself grows, and throughout the series, it's just hard to notice because it happens in such small increments over such an insane amount of time. It's just when you're watching it in the moment as just a fan, you just want to knock Luffy over the head and scream into the page or the screen and tell him to get the hell out of there. And it can be very frustrating to watch, but it is a great storytelling mechanism to see Luffy have to be put in these situations and for him to make mistakes and to grow. Magellan, on the other hand, is unlike any villain. I guess he's not really a villain. He's kind of an antagonist that we've faced, as he's not a Logia user where you can't touch him. It's actually the opposite, that if you do touch him, or if he hits you, you're as good as dead. Similarly, unlike Logias, there's not really an obvious natural counter to him or the poison, so he makes for a very interesting and difficult opposition. Another thing I have to mention is in the manga, this fight between Magellan and Luffy is drawn and paneled so well. It looks amazing in the manga. I feel like because of all the constant cutting away that the anime does, you lose that sort of frenetic flow and pace of this fight in the manga, because the manga version basically has this fight play out in one long sequence, only breaking it up when Bonkure ultimately has to make that tough choice to abandon Luffy and run away, which is just a heartbreaking moment because you know he wants to stay and help, but at the same time, you can't really hold it against him. Like, there's just no way to win at the moment. And Luffy's just kind of being selfish yet again, just to stay and fight. And the crazy thing is like, beating Magellan isn't even his primary objective. Like, his primary objective is to find Ace and save him. Like, he doesn't even need to beat Magellan. So this fight really is unnecessary. And the fact that it all started out because Luffy wanted to find food makes this fight even more unnecessary and kind of a waste. I know I'm about to kind of contradict myself a bit, but of course, now that we're in it and Luffy has no choice but to go all in, and fight, you gotta love this like forward thinking and willingness to put his life on the line for his dreams and goals. Like, he goes into gear second and is basically willing to sacrifice his body to win, and slams a massive jet bazooka on Magellan that does hurt him and bring him to his knees. And I'm sure this is the first time in a while that Magellan has probably experienced a huge hit like this, because most of the people know who Magellan is and they don't even want to risk touching him. And no one is crazy enough to even attempt to attack him while coated in the poison. But of course, Luffy is that crazy, and we all love him for that. However, that scream of pain at the end of episode 433 was blood-curdling when Luffy first experiences the sheer pain that the poison inflicts on him. Ooh, that looked like it hurts. Also, by the way, I love the art direction decision that they made in this fight to have Luffy's gear second appearance kind of glow and glisten even more than it normally does. Like, the bright white accents they animate on his skin look really cool. And I think this was actually a really smart way to visually show to the viewer that he is in gear second. Because if they did this kind of on the normal way, sort of, because he's in the blazing hell level, it's already very steamy and reddish due to the light from the fire and the boiling blood. And so it already gives him that pinkish reddish hue on everything. And it could easily be kind of lost that Luffy is in gear second. And so I love that they further amp up the accents of the glistening and the shining that he gets based when he does gear second. And yeah, I think the effect looks really cool and amazing here in the backdrop of the red blazing hell area. Now, this fight for me with Magellan stands out because of how different it is from most other fights. Right from the get-go, there seems to be this sense of dread, and you almost know for certain Luffy is going to lose. It's pretty similar to round one of Luffy versus Crocodile, but even then, I didn't go into that fight thinking that Luffy was outright gonna get massacred. That one, it just kind of slowly starts to dawn on you, because up to that point, no one has even remotely been a match for Luffy, but by this point, we're well aware that there are beings that are far and away more powerful, and you can recognize when one of those opponents show up, and Magellan is definitely one of them. And this fight is obviously not a triumphant one, or may not even be a very cool one to some people, but it serves to show us several things about Luffy. One, the aforementioned toxic traits of Luffy, his unwillingness to realize when to retreat, especially at the cost of those around him. And that poison inside him, where he always has to resort to head-on conflict to resolve everything. See what I did there? Seeing Luffy without his nakama here really highlights how much he needs them to balance these tendencies out. Whether it's them all knowing when to rein Luffy in for alternatives, or only unleashing him when it's the right time, especially Nami, Sanji, and Robin, who think very strategically about situations, or Usopp, who comes off as cowardly, but is often the voice of reason in terms of when they might need to think of alternatives. And of course, you do have Chopper there to mend Luffy when he does go all out and gets himself injured, but he has none of that anymore, and so you get situations like this where there's no one to sort of rein Luffy in and kind of direct his chaotic nature at the right place. Number two, though, is that we see just how strong Luffy's resolve and will is. And I don't know about you, but when Luffy decides to go all in, resolving to give up his arms on the slim chance to beat Magellan, really shows just how strong-willed Luffy is. He is essentially putting everything on the line, including his life and ability to continue pursuing his dream and adventures to save Ace. I'm sure Luffy doesn't think like this, but on the chance that he does win and survive this battle, with the poison, he might be pretty much permanently incapacitated or disabled from the toxins. There is just something really sobering about seeing Luffy make this decision, and it really hits you, at least on a deeper level, I feel like, or at least it did me. And yeah, he makes a similar decision when going all in versus Lucci by pushing gear second and his lifespan to its limit, but the impact and consequence of that decision is still a very abstract one that won't really come to fruition till much, much later on in his life. But this decision is a clear and present danger, and will have immediate and instant consequences, as we'll see. Now, before we move on, I kind of want to highlight a sort of translator's note here with what Magellan says to Luffy just after he was brought to his knees from the jet bazooka. Magellan kind of sympathizes with Luffy as he suffers from the poison and says, "It must really hurt, poor boy." So the phrase that Magellan says in Japanese for poor boy is kinodoku, which is a general phrase to indicate you feel sorry for them, but literally translate ki means feelings or heart, and doku, obviously we've already established, is poison. So he's basically saying he's caused Luffy poison of the heart or feelings, which is very fitting wordplay for Magellan here. So I know I praised the anime for its animation earlier with Luffy, but I, for the life of me, cannot understand nor like the creative choice that they made with how Magellan takes damage from Luffy. So what I'm talking about is in the anime, when Luffy hits him, they leave these indented marks of poison in Magellan, almost making it look like he's a Logia fruit user, which he's not. It's clearly established by Oda that he is a Paramecia user. And the manga never once showed these sort of poison indents, as far as I can tell. I went back and looked at every encounter that Magellan has, and I don't think this shows up here nor in any future conflicts, but correct me if I'm wrong. But yeah, it just muddies the water in how Magellan's fruit works, which I'm not a huge fan of. Like, in the grand scheme of things, this is certainly a very much a nitpick that has no bearing on much of the story, but I just don't like that they went out of their way to make this change when it wasn't even necessary. But also, speaking of that fruit, can we just take a minute to discuss just how OP Magellan is? This dude is freaking crazy. Like, most if not all Paramecia are inferior to him. No one can pretty much directly hit him, and even if you use Haki, you're still probably going to be poisoned. And even if you don't touch him with like a Logia fruit power, you still have to be aware of all the ranged poison attacks, not to mention the poison gas, which most people can't even get away from. Like, I can't tell you how oppressive fighting a person with this type of skill set must be. And not only that, but Magellan has this insanely tough body by itself. Like, he's supposedly human, but seriously, he looks otherworldly with his like horns and wings, and he's like 3 to 4 times bigger than a normal human. And clearly, we saw him tank Luffy's jet bazooka like it was nothing. I mean, it brought him to his knees, but he got up like he was just took a punch or something. And I think Oda realized this to a certain extent about how overpowered he made Magellan, which I'll briefly touch upon in the spoiler section. You know, I'm not saying he's unbeatable because no one is unbeatable, but he is crazy strong, and the Doku Doku no Mi is still one of the most crazy fruits in the series thus far, I feel like. Now, it quickly becomes clear that Luffy has lost this fight when he starts flailing around, but true to Luffy, he doesn't give up. And to the very end, he goes gear second once again, despite his body completely overtaken by the effects of Magellan's poison. And he's pretty much blind, his hearing is starting to go, and he's starting to feel numb, which I wish I had that kind of like perseverance and ability to push onward despite the desperate situation. But also, at the same time, because of this attitude from Luffy and the decades of sort of fiction tropes shoved down our throats of heroes bearing down and somehow making it out of these situations, like, you know, with some sort of an ass pull, either a character shows up or a new technique or a new weapon or transformation just shows up out of nowhere to save the day. It's all the more shocking when the next scene, Luffy, you see him, he's utterly defeated in this very pathetic fashion, just covered in poison and laying there with his mouth agape and white-eyed, like looking like he's almost dead. I mean, this was pretty crazy. Now, obviously, Luffy isn't going to die, but seeing Luffy take L after L is definitely starting to become something I notice as a pattern. You know, this pattern of the world really starting to catch up with Luffy and surpassing basically anything he could have ever imagined. Well, it's hard to watch your lovable, ever-positive hero get bodied like this constantly now for the better part of a couple years. I love the storytelling here because it creates amazing drama and opportunity for growth in Luffy. I know it's cliche to say this, but we are basically in sort of the Empire Strikes Back phase of One Piece, where the story is taking our hero to their lowest point to really show them who they are and what they must do to grow. And this is another reason why Impel Down is such a fun and good arc, because it's so different from not only the rest of One Piece, but it really subverts a lot of the tropes that, from the flow of all the other shonen series we've seen. I mean, we've certainly seen Luffy lose quite a bit. Actually, in fact, pretty much every saga since entering the Grand Line, we've seen him lose. But I haven't felt this helpless about Luffy's power gaps since probably round 1 with Crocodile, like I mentioned earlier, when he gets impaled, which was also a truly shocking moment. But this scene with Magellan is very comparable, at least from the stance of an emotional response. But I also feel like this is much more of a demoralizing loss in terms of where he's at in the story. But with Luffy now having taken the loss, Luffy is brought to level 5, which happens to be the freezing hell. And I can't help but think to myself, this is Oda referencing the old idiom when hell freezes over, with this level, with the past level being the closest to what hell is usually depicted as, at least in our culture. Which now seems like a good time to also bring up the fact that Impel Down is clearly a reference to Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy, where hell is also composed of different levels or circles of inescapable areas with different sets of punishments contained within each. Especially level 3, 4, and 5 seem to be direct references to specific circles contained within the Divine Comedy, with level 3 being the 3rd circle, gluttony, level 4 being the 7th circle, violence, and level 5 being a reference to the 9th circle, treachery. Now, I've never read the Divine Comedy, so that's about the level of commentary I can give you on that. But that's just kind of the light research that I got to do on this. Now, meanwhile, we find out the aftermath of what happened at level 3's gate, where Buggy and Galdino were being held. And in a bit of a twist that I originally didn't see coming, but in hindsight, I really should have. I don't know why, but I didn't see this. But Boncré transformed into Hannibal and sneaks the two prisoners out right from under Magellan. In a dire situation, it's found out that with the amount of poison Luffy was exposed to, they can't quite cure him with any sort of antidote. So Boncré, for his part, despite running away and abandoning Luffy, even when he pretty much had every right to do so, in my opinion, can't live with himself and wants nothing more than to go back and save his friend. And him yelling that to Buggy and Galdino really cemented to me that Boncré is the real deal. He really is a true friend to Luffy. And I think at this point, for me, I just really wanted to see him join the crew. I think at this point, I don't know how you can't really see that coming to fruition. But yeah, we'll talk about that a little bit more maybe in the spoiler section. Now, when all hope for saving Luffy seems lost, Boncré all of a sudden remembers a man capable of miracles locked up somewhere in Impel Down called Iba-san. And I just love Buggy and Galdino's response to this dramatic revolution, because it's pretty much our response, who's Iba-san? No one. We've only heard of this miracle man once prior, and even then, it was very vague. So we see on the prisoner list that Boncré gets from one of the guards that in addition to the person he's searching for, whose name is revealed to be Emporio Ivankov, but we get a not-so-hidden Panda Man sighting, as he's listed as one of the prisoners locked up in Impel Down as well. And also kind of another bit of trivia that I found out from my light research was that Rosh Thompson, who's above Ivankov on the list, is also based on a real-life pirate named Rosh Braziliano. So yeah, take that for what you will. And another odd bit of trivia that I think is specific to the Crunchyroll subtitles is the fact that they spelled Ivankov's name wrong when it's literally on screen. So the subtitle is spelled Ivancov, when on the page image it clearly says in big letters Ivankov with a K instead of a C. So I don't know if they use some sort of software to automatically generate these subtitles, but it blows my mind that you can see the writing right there and then the subtitle right underneath it is spelled incorrectly. I don't know how that happened. Although the next scene I legit cracked up when they get to the gate and the guards are all admiring Hanyabol's or Bonkrei's ability to get into the freezing hell without a code or weapons. And I think for me, it's just how positive the guards are in admiration of Hanyabol contrasted with Bonkrei's like sheer shock at what's about to happen. It's so funny to me for some reason. Now, shifting back to on a more serious note, this final scene of episode 437, I don't think it's enough credit for how powerful it is. And the true power and virtue that Luffy possesses is pretty admirable here. So the scene in question is Luffy writhing and struggling to get to Ace as he's dying of the poison, with the onlooking inmates basically saying he should just give up because in a place like this, and perhaps a metaphor for the world too, that you should only really look out for yourself. And if you find yourself in danger, you should always just use and sacrifice the next guy around you to survive, which Luffy would never do. And we talked about this a bit throughout the entire series so far, but Luffy has this innate and amazing ability to motivate others to act. And usually Luffy not only saves people, towns, or even full countries, but he also motivates the people within those to help themselves as well. His actions and sort of his sincere desire to do good makes people want to do good, and as a byproduct, can then turn them to Luffy's side as an ally. And this arc is kind of the ultimate culmination of this theme, as he's literally turning former villains to his cause and helping him save Ace. And that passion, loyalty, and perseverance is often rewarded to Luffy in the form of random people coming to Luffy's aid when he needs them, and we'll continue to see this aspect of Luffy explored further and expanded upon. But in this immediate moment, just mere seconds after the inmates bashed Luffy for continuing to struggle, and his perseverance and sincerity is rewarded with Bonkrei showing up again to help Luffy. And this scene is amazing, but if there was one thing I could change, was the order in which these scenes happen. So I wish 437 and in the manga, I wish we got this moment first, so that the reveal that Bonkrei came back to save him at this moment was actually a surprise, that we didn't know he was coming. And so when we saw him bash, or when we saw the inmates bash Luffy, we might think, oh, well, yeah, they kind of have a point. And then all of a sudden, Luffy's sort of struggle is rewarded, and the fact that he hasn't given up is rewarded by Bonkrei just showing up and there ready to save him. I think the emotional impact of this moment would have been much greater. And then you would have sort of the other scenes of how Bonkrei got there and how he saved Gaudino and Buggy explained in a flashback. And then you have that moment with all that stuff. But, it's just a small nitpick. I still think this scene is great. I just think it could have been amazing had they sort of hit you with that surprise that Bonkrei returned. But anyways, overall, these 3 episodes I really enjoyed. I think definitely the first matchup between Magellan and Luffy did not disappoint, although it was pretty brutal as a fan of Luffy for sure. But yeah, we'll see what happens next with Bonkrei. Now that he's found Luffy once again, but now they're stuck in the freezing hell of level 5. Will they'll have to brave many of the different obstacles to find this miracle Ivankov before Luffy succumbs to the poison. And from this point on is where I feel like the real Impel Down begins, because things are about to get nuts. And yeah, I really can't wait to talk about more of Impel Down. But anyways, if you did enjoy this, send me a like or comment. And if you want to join me on this journey of rewatching One Piece, please consider subscribing. Check out my Instagram and Twitter account, or I guess X account, at SunnyGo Podcast if you want updates of when I post new episodes or see some pictures of my manga collection. Check those out. And I also wanted to take a moment to thank PK for their generous donation and support via my Buy Me a Coffee account. And I know I generally don't really emphasize asking for donations, and by no means do any of you need to feel obligated to, but it's always nice to see that, and everyone's encouraging words are really cool as well. I do put in a lot of time and work into this podcast, and while I do this primarily for fun and for my love of One Piece, it is always nice to see that support. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you, and thank you to everyone else who just listens and subscribes as well. As always, again, thanks for taking the time out to listen to the podcast. Small spoiler section today, nothing too big, but just a couple points that I wanted to discuss. But if you're not interested in those, stay safe out there, and I hope to see you on the next episode. Bye. Alrighty, so spoiler section, just kind of really two small things that I kind of wanted to mention. First is Magellan's OP status. So yeah, Magellan is definitely really strong, and I think Oda was pretty aware of this, which is why he kind of, I mean, he essentially wrote Magellan out of the story, it seems like. So obviously after Luffy breaks out with everybody and you see this the world's biggest prison break ever in Impel Down history. And so Magellan is relieved of his position and Hannibal takes over as warden of Impel Down. And we never really hear from Magellan ever again. And I think the reason why is because, yeah, Oda recognized just how strong Magellan's power is and his Devil Fruit ability could be. And I think he just didn't want to deal with that anymore. And so, yeah, we just don't ever really hear from Magellan anymore. And the other thing is that I kind of wanted to talk about briefly was the idea of Boncré joining the Straw Hats. Now, this is definitely something I myself, and I know a lot of fans, really wish would happen someday. Of course, we know at the end of Impel Down that Boncré yet again sacrifices himself for Luffy's escape. And, you know, as far as we know, he's still stuck in Impel Down. Of course, we do find out later on that he has survived the fight against Magellan, but he's still stuck in Impel Down. But he is now the new queen of the Newcomer Land in Impel Down, or, you know, what we'll go on to see as level 5.5. And he basically takes over for Ivankov, kind of providing safe haven for some of the inmates in Impel Down. I hope we do get to see Boncré yet again at some point, and he's released from Impel Down somehow to help Luffy towards the end of the series. But yeah, as far as him becoming a Straw Hat, it just doesn't seem like it's ever going to happen, which is a bit of a disappointment just because of how well he seems to get along, particularly with Luffy, Chopper, and Usopp. I think that dynamic would be really fun. And the fact that, like, he's played by the same actor as Frankie, I think it would be interesting to see Frankie and Boncré there at the same time, both of them reacting to each other. I think that would be hilarious, but sadly we probably won't get that. But anyways, those are the only things I kind of wanted to talk about in the spoiler section. Nothing too major, but just a couple whimsical thoughts on my part. Anyways, I appreciate you hanging around and listening, and I hope to see you in the next episode. See ya!